It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
This campaign had been swept under the carpet of history for some particularly good reasons. At the time, it was a 30-day war. With limited resources, we defeated a much more superior Arab Iraqi army and air force. But we relied on Arab goodwill to keep the empire running. And there's in 1940, 41, 42, I mean, Egypt and North Africa, and we couldn't be doing with an Arab uprising. So the last thing we wanted to do was publicize the fact that we defeated the Arabs so humiliatingly.
Hello. In early May of 1941, in the deserts of Iraq that had seen the armies of Alexander battle Darius and the Persian Empire, a force of 9,000 Arabs and Iraqis descended on the small British airfield of Habbinayah. Only 39 pilots and a small collection of antiquated and obsolete aircraft stood between British maintenance of crucial oil fields and their loss and consequent disaster for fuel supplies to the British Army and the Royal Navy in Egypt and throughout the Mediterranean. Joining today is James Dunford Wood, who describes the extraordinary story of defiance and heroism that he has described as the Second World War's Rorke's Drift. Coming up, I have Max Hastings discussing Sword Beach during D-Day, women of the ancient world, and since summer is approaching, the history of Test cricket. Please do share with family and friends, and if you could subscribe or follow and give a kind review, I'd be most grateful. But until then, it's me talking the big little war with James Dunford Wood. James, a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Very happy to be here.
And we're discussing the big little war. And this, as the publisher has written in the blurb, I was actually really not familiar at all with this big little war, which, just for the benefit of the listeners, I should briefly explain. This is really the Iraqi theatre we're talking in the first few years of the war. And so I wanted to just kick off really is to just ask you, I know the subtitle says the incredible story of how 39 pilots from an RAF flying school changed the course of World War II, which is quite a grand claim.
Yes.
Which we shall get to.
Yes, I've been picked up on that a few times, but yes, it is a grand claim. could have perhaps changed the course. The course may have been different if the result had gone the other way. That's my thesis. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's a compelling one because, of course, Iraq, as we know from more recent history, has a product there that's sought after. But could you just give a bit of background to what Iraq, if we're looking at September 39 as the beginning of the war, what's happening in Iraq up as we build up to May 1941, which are really the events that you write about?
Yeah. So in the late 1930s, Iraq was a solid British ally. I mean, it had been a mandate up until 31 under United Nations, post World War One, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, had been granted as a mandate. But in the early 30s, that mandate came to an end, and it morphed into a kind of treaty of cooperation and friendship and mutual support. And as part of that treaty, the British were entitled to station troops and have couple of RAF bases actually in Iraq, principally from the British perspective, in order to kind of maintain their lines of communication through the empire from India to Egypt, on that line, and also to provide a certain amount of security to the oil fields. They didn't supply Britain itself directly, but they supplied our interests and forces in the Middle East, and also to a certain extent in India. And of course, they've been exploited and developed by British-based oil companies. It was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and then that morphed into BP or one of those things. So at that time, the oil had been extracted with British money using British resources. So they were there to protect that, but principally to guard the lines of communication. So it was safe, it was friendly. We had there was a royal family who were very Anglophile.
Faisal II.
Correct.
Huge fan of him, a great lover of cricket.
Yes, I believe so. And he sent his son to Harrow, and he used to come and visit London a lot, and it was on pally terms with the British royal family. Anyway, it was a typical kind of empire story of the 30s. People being nice to each other at that level of society. I mean, Iraq itself was fairly fragmented into various different tribes, both Sunni, Shia, Kurds in the north. So it was quite a fragmented society, but it was held together by this British-based form of parliamentary government with a royal family at the head of it. And of course, Faisal was one of you trace that family back to the time of Lawrence Arabia and setup that had been put in place after World War One, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So it was a safe place. That was the situation at the beginning of the war. And they were, of course, allied to us, albeit in a sort of, they didn't get involved militarily, but they were allied to us at the beginning of the war. And at the British behest, the German ambassador and the embassy was closed. The ambassador was thrown out. We kept trying to get them to remove the Italians. The Italians, of course, came to the war a bit later, but that by that time there was a certain amount of anti-British feeling had started to be generated.
Okay, and so you mentioned we've got a couple of air bases and a number of troops. I mean, what is the sort of British presence there militarily?
Well, actually, very few troops. Actually, early on, when it had been a mandate, and when Britain was actually sort of controlling the government and had control over the security of the country, we soon realized that the best way to quote unquote control the tribes was by use of RAF forces. So we relied largely on the RAF and some light formations of troops, often locally raised, in order to guard those bases. So there was no significant army presence. But we had an air base in Shaiba, which was just outside Basra, and we had also an air base at Habbinayah, which had been built in the mid-30s. And this was built largely as a training school. So it was where RAF pilots went from that part of the world, from the Middle East and the Far East. They went to train at Habbinayah. So it was a training, and it was state of the art. I mean, it was built with clubs and facilities and beautifully manicured lawns, and they had early forms of air conditioning and some of the office buildings. It was an amazing place by all accounts. when
And that was the place. So if you were a training pilot in sort of Singapore, you would go to Habbinayah to learn your.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And they had a training school there, and there was another training school in Egypt, which was the onset of war was also moved across to Habbinayah. So it was considered a safe place to learn to fly, partly because it was far from any possible front line. And also, if you think about it, flying in the desert, it's rather like learning to drive a car on Tyree. I mean, you're not going to crash into anything. And if you crash land, it's flat. So I mean, it was a safe place to learn to fly if you could deal with the heat. And in fact, ironically, only 6 to 9 months before the battle I describe, Roald Dahl learned to fly there as a young man.
Ah, okay, yes, because I remember reading about, of course, his book Boy, where he is stationed in East Africa afterwards then.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So 39 going into 1940, there's not a huge amount happening in Iraq?
Well, I mean, the thing is, there are things happening beneath the surface, and the British, in the form of the ambassador, basically, who was the one who's meant to have his ear on the ground, they kind of didn't take it seriously enough. So the Germans had started to, so their ambassador had been removed. The ambassador, a guy called Grobber, Herr Grobber, who'd been sent back to Berlin. He was by all accounts quite an expert in Middle Eastern affairs and a great sort of lover of Iraq and Iraqi culture. And he didn't stop work, even though he'd been sent home. And he maintained his contacts in Baghdad and started throughout the 30s to start to rebuild their kind of influence. And in fact, all the way through the 30s, the Germans had been, under the leadership of this ambassador, had been trying to wean Iraq away from British influence. So they'd invited them to the Olympics. They invited their army officers to train in German academies. They started an equivalent of a Hitler Youth movement in Baghdad. So even after the German ambassador was thrown out, he still tried to maintain. So there'd been this sort of German influence throughout the 30s, which built up steam and didn't go away at the outbreak of war. So there was quite a lot going on under the surface, which the British kind of didn't really take seriously enough. Of course, that's what led to the coup d'etat and the Rashid Ali, who threw out the boy king and the regent.
Yes. So let's talk about the coup then.
This guy, Rashid Ali, he'd been in and out of government, but he was a German sympathizer. He eventually managed the early part of 1941 to get himself returned to power and eventually to throw out the regent. So he'd been building up to this, but in order to be successful and to throw out the British, he was trying to win the support of the Germans to his cause. And the cause, of course, was Arab nationalism. They wanted to build a caliphate. Palestine, of course, was blowing up at this point and had been for some years. Cause throughout the Middle East to try and build a pan-Arab state. The Mufti of Jerusalem, who'd been a sort of big supporter of Palestine against the Jews, had been thrown out of Jerusalem. I mean, he'd given sanctuary in Baghdad by the Iraqis. So there was his influence as well. So in order to be successful, to throw out the British, Rashid Ali knew he had to build up support from the Germans. Years leading up, right up the beginning of the war, 1939 to 1940, at the beginning of the war, he was making overtures to the Germans and through the Italians, because the Italian embassy was still in operation. The Iraqis refused to remove the Italian ambassador, even though they were pressured by the British. That was going on. And when he got enough encouragement from the Germans. They'd been having meetings in Ankara in Turkey with between representatives of the Iraqi government and German ambassador. They'd got enough signals that the Germans potentially would look favorably on and provide support if they rebelled. But at the same time, the British started to wake up. So it all kind of came to a head in April 1941. And in a way, Rashid Ali was kind of, he went a little bit too early. He didn't quite have the support on the ground that he wanted from the Germans yet. Hitler at the time was very focused on Barbarossa, which was to come in June. So it was a difficult period, but the British finally woke up to what was going on and started to reinforce Iraq with troops from India. So it all came to a head, the coup d'etat, and he jumped early.
Okay, and so in Habbinayah airfield, which is, I think, where much of what you write about happens, Um, what's sort of life like whilst these rumblings are going
So,
on?
I should give you the context of why I'm interested in this story because I think it's quite
Yes,
important.
we should mention,
So
yes.
because that's where I get that's where I discovered this whole thing. It turned out, and I'd only discovered this later because my father, who was he was in the Indian Army, then he transferred to the RAF and then went back to the army after the war. But he died when I was quite young. I was 11, so I didn't hear this story directly from him. But after he died, I discovered these diaries that he'd written, and actually they span 1938 right through to 1947. So they cover the whole period of the war. And of course, in the war, it was, technically you weren't allowed really to write diaries on the front line, but he kept them all the way through all of the campaigns he fought in. One of the stories here was about his time at Habbinayah, and it turned out that he was one of these 39 pilots, right? And I thought, God, that sounds interesting. It was fascinating stuff. So, and he wrote all about the atmosphere at the time, and they were, it was a jolly, they were sailing, they were playing polo, they were kind of, shooting desert fox. They were having a typically British kind of,
I'm getting a slight sense of Evelyn Waugh, but you can tell me I'm
a little
completely
bit like that at that point, right? Because they thought he'd been sent to learn, because he was in the Indian Army. He volunteered to join the RAF because his brother had been in the RAF, was actually killed in 1940 in France in flying the Blenheim. But anyway, he then transferred to the RAF, and they sent him to Habbinayah to learn to fly in January of 1941. So it was all written up in these diaries. So I found the diaries. I did some research. I found one or two books on this, but not a lot. One of them was written by a guy called Air Vice Marshal Dudgeon, which is a brilliant book. He was also he was a squadron leader and one of these pilots, and he wrote about it after the war. And it's a great book, but it's not particularly historically sophisticated. I mean, it's just a great yarn. Freya Stark wrote about it from her perspective in the embassy because she was a British intelligence officer in the embassy, which was besieged during this period of the uprising. And then there was another book I discovered by a guy called Somerset de Chair, who wrote about the relief column that came from Egypt. So that was it, right? And if you look at Churchill's history, there's a couple of paragraphs. And there's, moreover, my father had all these medals from all sorts of places. He had a DFC, he had this, he had, medals from all these campaigns, but nothing from Iraq. I thought, well, what's going on? Where so then I did the research and I discovered all this stuff about how this campaign had been kind of swept under the carpet of history for some particularly good reasons. At the time, it was a 30-day war with limited resources. We defeated a much more superior Arab Iraqi army and air force. But we relied on Arab goodwill to keep the empire running in 1940, 41, 42. I mean, Egypt and North Africa, and we couldn't be doing with an Arab uprising. So the last thing we wanted to do was publicize the fact that we defeated the Arabs so humiliatingly, right? So at the time, it was swept under the carpet. And after the war, most of the histories, it seems to me, the official histories were well, the one who had the most influence on this was Wavell. He wrote the official history of this period. And he was looking at it from an army perspective. And from the army perspective, we'd been caught with our pants down, right? And the people that had saved the day, my contention, and it's proved by, I think, by a lot of what I write about, were this fledgling RAF school, who, if they'd failed, the camp would have been overrun, the Germans could have flown in their planes, we would have been toast, all right? And then we would have lost access to the oil, Middle East, which ran on this oil. Wavell could not have survived. And Rommel was coming from Tobruk, we would have lost all the oil, the fleet wouldn't be able to sail. There are all sorts of
dreadful scenarios,
things after that you can imagine, we wouldn't have been able to invade up through Italy potentially.
And Hitler, of course, was would become desperate for oil later as well then.
Well, it's true. I mean, but it also was a fact that Hitler didn't see it. His eye was on Barbarossa for very good reasons. And the one who was, ironically, there were four key characters in leadership positions. There was Hitler and Ribbentrop on the German side, and there was Churchill and Wavell on the British side. Churchill understood the importance of Iraq, and so did Ribbentrop. Hitler was he'd never really liked the Arabs, the Arab states, for all sorts of reasons, which he identified in detail in Mein Kampf. But basically, he also was, fixated on Russia. And on our side, Wavell had his own problems with Rommel, with the defeat in Greece. He didn't get it, right? He didn't want to provide support. So for about 2 weeks, the British school was on its own.
Okay.
And the other bit, which was so exciting, is all they had to fly were these old string bags. They call them string bags, these old biplanes, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, should we talk about the planes that they had at their disposal then? Because reading these, there's certainly one plane, the Fairy, which I seem to remember. I mean, that's the more modern of the three that they have, isn't it?
Talking about the Fairy Battle, they didn't have that.
Yes.
They didn't have that. Wasn't there? They had a lot of what Hart train. So there's I'm not really an aircraft nerd, but I can tell you there are a lot of aircraft nerds that have been in touch with me, and
Yeah.
they're fascinating. So there's an aircraft, Hawker Hart, which had many variations. They had a number of Hawker Hart trainers, which were unarmed. They had a number of Hawker Audaxes, which were a sort of a beefed up version of the Hart, which did have some armaments, which were used for training. They had something called the Oxford, which was, I think, a 3-man, I think it's one pilot and an observer and a gunner or something. And it was used for sort of training observers and gunners. And then they had a few sort of old lumbering kind of Valencias and transport planes.
So there's not a Hurricane or a Spitfire inside.
There was well, no, there was no, not in the early stages. The Hurricanes, a few Hurricanes were sent 2 or 3 weeks later from Egypt. In the early stages, the only things they were sent 3 Gladiators, which were, they weren't modern, but I mean, they were only, they were still used in the Middle East, Gladiators, and they were quite good fighters, but they were biplanes. That we were sent 3 of those, but they were sent. As soon as they arrived, the pilots went home again. So, because they were needed they were brought out of storage in Egypt, flown over, and then the pilots. I don't know how the pilots got back, but anyway, they were dumped on the training school. So yeah, we had Audaxes, we had Oxfords.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. And the training school, the trainee pilots, I mean, how many pilots were actually, I guess had a number of hours under their belts so that they could...
Of the 39, it's quite hard to work out because, I've been through all sorts of documents and I've been to the National Archives to figure out who fought where and what and things, but as far as I can tell, of the 39 pilots, 34 of them were either instructors or senior retired RAF officers who were in management positions but were suddenly told to get in a plane, right? Because the school was populated with or run by semi-retired RAF officers. They'd probably fought in World War I, they'd done their service, cushy job, nice posting, lovely camp, we'll run this place. So they were sent there. So these guys were suddenly told to get into planes, plus the instructors, and there were probably, I don't know, 25 of those, right? As far as I can tell, there were only 4 pilots who were training to be pilots at that point, who were not instructors, who were pupils, put it this way, of the school, who were these 4 Indian Army officers who transferred, including my father was one of them. And I've got a picture of the 4 of them.
The 4 musketeers.
Exactly. 2 of whom were killed in the battle, and 2 of whom, obviously my father survived and another guy. There were other observers and gunners, obviously, who were training because Audax is a 2-seater, so you'd have a gunner who was a pupil and so on. But my father was up in play, and he'd passed his he'd passed his intermediate exam about a week before the battle started, but he hadn't passed his advanced. So he was halfway through his training, but he trained enough to be able to fly a plane. So, yeah, of the 39, I think there were 35 mixed instructors and officers, senior officers, a couple of wing commanders. And this most amazing guy, Dudgeon, who had been fighting in North Africa. He'd been sent for R&R to Habbinayah to sort of recover from his battle fatigue, and suddenly found himself, 3 weeks before this thing. I mean, he arrived just as the coup d'etat took place. So it was about a month before the coup d'etat took place, and the time when the Iraqis decided to march on the camp. In that time, this guy Dudgeon basically got the camp organized. He got the planes bombed up because they didn't have half of them were missing the relevant bomb racks, and he was a much as I'd like my father to be the hero of the story, this guy was the hero of the story, and he wrote the book about it. Anyway, so he figures quite heavily in the book.
It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
And so are I've got visions of these sort of the 39 or so. The 39 are kind of living a fairly relaxed life until the coup d'etat. So they have to put the pink gins down and get on with it.
Absolutely.
So is it sort of one moment off in the distance it's all clear, and then the next minute they see sort of thousands upon thousands of angry Iraqis heading towards them?
Well, effectively, I mean, in the month, they all know about the coup d'etat, and then they're no longer allowed to go to Baghdad to go to the nightclubs because it was off limits. So they knew what was going on, but it was just suddenly the Iraqis. My father was sent up in. He was sent up in a plane to sort of do recce's every day, and a number of the other pilots the same. And at one point, just before the Iraqis started marching on the camp, all the women and children from the embassy and the British community in Baghdad were sent in lorries and trucks and buses to Habbinayah to be evacuated. And at that point, the Iraqis started advancing. So they had a bit of early warning, but I mean, then they went up in the morning and they saw all these gun in place, and the guns had been set up, and these little Italian tanks had arrived, because Habbinayah, the camp was very, very vulnerable because it was built in a flat stretch of desert under an escarpment. At the top of the escarpment, it was overlooked from this escarpment. In fact, the airfield was right underneath the escarpment. So if you put some artillery on the top of this escarpment, you could basically have a clear view and line of sight of the airfield. So they had to move a lot of the planes to the polo ground, which was behind trees on the other side of the camp, to avoid, and that was very hairy landing on the polo ground because it had some very tall trees around the edge of it, and it was hairy. So but they couldn't get all the planes there. So some of the planes still had to take off from the main airfield. And then the second thing is the camp had not been built with a view to having to fight a war, and so therefore there was one water tower, one electricity unit, they didn't have any redundancy built in. So one hit on the water tower, they would have been sunk. They all had to fill their baths up at the beginning of the battle with water, just because, just in case.
It's extraordinary. It really
So
is.
I'll just show you on the screen here. I've got this. This is my father's diary entry. This is the first entry from May. I don't know if you can see it. May the 3rd. War, right? So I've published these diaries, right? I think
I'll put links in the show notes.
So that's what I saw, aged whatever I was when I discovered these diaries, 16 or 18 or something, and yeah, they're all here. And the most amazing thing is that before I published the book, I published these war diaries online on a kind of blog. About sort of 7 or 8 years ago, and I would get a lot of emails from people who say, "Oh, my father, my grandfather, my uncle, he was in this thing or he was there," and I built an amazing amount of relationships with people who came out of the woodwork to talk about what had been going on. But yeah, so
incredible. So and was it really they had to presumably carry out bombing runs against the?
They had to. Well, yeah. So the one big asset they had was that the RAF moved. There was a squadron of Wellington bombers in Shaiba, right, in Basra, and I think they reinforced that just before the battle started. So when they decided. So what the British decided was that. There was a guy, the other element, this was the commandant of the camp was a guy called Air Vice Marshal Smart. And there's certain theories about this guy, how competent he was and whatever, but he was certainly in a very tricky position because he kept asking, "What am I supposed to do? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to?" He asked Churchill, he asked the Air Ministry in London, he asked the Egypt, Cairo. He was talking to the British High Command in India for advice, and they all said, "Well, you're on your own, mate, because we can't get any help to you for at least 2 weeks. Stick there, And eventually, Churchill sent a message saying, "Look, you've got to. The only way you're going to win this is to strike preemptively." So the Iraqis had not attacked us. All they'd done is surrounded the camp, but demanded that we stop flying, stop lessons, right? So this guy had a really, really difficult decision to make. What do I do? He made the decision to preemptively attack the Iraqi forces at 5 o'clock on whenever it is, 2nd, at first light of dawn, and he. In sync with these Wellington bombers, which took off in Basra. I don't know how many hours it took, but maybe they took off at 3 a.m. But they bombed the escarpment just as the Audaxes and the Oxfords were taking off for Habbinayah. So it was this huge attack on the Iraqi. We basically caught them, napping. I mean, they were asleep, but it was a preemptive strike. But within 3 days, this guy had a nervous breakdown and had to be shipped out. The commandant. He couldn't. He just. Yeah, I mean, it's debatable whether it was a nervous breakdown. The official story was he had a car accident. Well, it's a bit odd, but anyway. All the eyewitness accounts I've seen say basically he had a nervous. His nerves went, and they had to ship him out. So after that, the rest of the battle was fought, with through committee. I mean, there was a committee of RAF's officers running it, and until someone else could be flown in. So it was touch and go, because they lost a third of their planes on day one.
And what are the Iraqis using to fight back? Are they?
Well, then they've got, of course, they've got artillery to shell the camp, but they've also got a very strong, significant air force based in Baghdad, which had ironically been trained and and equipped by the British. And until a few weeks before, we'd had people instructing them. We had RAF officers, pally with the Iraqis, helping them run their air force. They had to be withdrawn, and now suddenly, and the Iraqis had more modern planes. I mean, they had Italian Savoyas. They had something called a CR-42. Anyway, they had more modern fighters. So they started attacking Habbinayah from Baghdad. So we were, this was a Rorke's drift moment. I mean, really. If the point is, if the Iraqis had decided to attack with all their forces, their infantry, and come down from the escarpment, they could have walked into the camp. The question is, why didn't they do that? And my contention is that at that time, we can't rely on this anymore as British people, but in those days, Britain was like, the imperial power. We were the ones they all looked up to. We were the ones they were terrified of. They didn't have the confidence, to kind of. I believe that's what it was. They didn't have the confidence or to take it by the scruff of the neck and just walk in. So they relied on their artillery shelling the camp, and they relied on their air force bombing from Baghdad. And also, I think the Iraqi troops were led to believe they were on a training exercise. This is a typical kind of goes on today, right? You're on a training well, actually, no, you might have to fight. So I think the Iraqi troops themselves are a little bit ambivalent, but I think they were scared, basically.
It's an incredible story. It really is. And I was looking through. There's a message from Churchill that is dispatched, but it's a little premature because he seems to think everything's now, the attack's been repulsed and everything is now hunky dory. But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah. When was that? I wonder.
I think that's the 8th of May.
Yeah. So
yes, he sends something on the 8th of May.
Yes, I haven't got.
Your vigorous and splendid action has largely.
Yes. No. Okay. So no, we had actually broken the back of the siege at that point. So there were two phases to this. Well, probably three actually. So by the 6th or the 7th. We had broken the morale of the Iraqis, right? Because we'd been relentlessly bombing them. But, we were probably a day away from not being able to do that anymore because we'd lost so many planes. The Iraqis retreated from the escarpment. And a lot of them went back to Baghdad. Now, in their retreat was chaotic. And my father writes about one morning it was probably after 3 or 4 days morning on the 6th or something, 5th or 6th or 7th, where there's this long line of Iraqi transport all trying to get back to Baghdad along one road, and traffic jams, and they sent the planes out and they just bombed them to smithereens. And my father was going on about this not being cricket. I mean, he writes, but it was a massacre. Now, we hadn't broken the back of Iraq at that point, but we had broken the siege. And that siege was broken by these 39 pilots. At the same time, a column was on its way from Egypt and Palestine. They didn't have enough transport, so they had to.
I mean, that's a hell of a long way, isn't it?
It's 500 miles or kilometers. Anyway, it had never. Well, Somerset de Chair maintains it had never been crossed since the days of Alexander the Great by an army. But anyway,
that really appeals to me, actually.
What?
That really appeals to me.
So they had to commandeer city buses from the streets of Jerusalem because they didn't have enough transport, right, to take a lot of these troops. Anyway, they didn't arrive till whatever it was, 10th, 11th, 12th of May. So at this point, they were still en route. So there was this period of a few days, maybe up to a week, between when the siege had been broken and when the relief column arrived, where the Germans were beginning to arrive, right? And Messerschmitts and Heinkel's 2 squadrons had been sent via Syria, and they'd landed in the north in Mosul. And they had started sort of probing the British, and in that period, we started to get Messerschmitts and Heinkels kind of bombing the camp. And that was pretty serious because those bombs were a lot bigger than the Iraqis had. But we were days away at that point from the column arriving. And moreover, the Germans were not as used as us to desert warfare. So they got the wrong type of fuel. They hadn't put sand filters on, and their planes, they degraded very quickly. So they didn't send enough, and they didn't send, properly equipped planes. So we survived that, but only just. And then, so that was second phase. Third phase, the column has arrived, and third phase is march on Baghdad. And that's another whole story, which I write about in the book. But I mean, obviously the RAF were less involved other than supporting the troops. But again, there's an amazing story about 2,000 British troops defeating an army of 20,000 Iraqis, basically by bluff. I don't know whether you've read that part of the book, but there's a point at which... and Somerset Share describes it very well. I've lifted it from his book basically because he was the witness. But they're on the road to Baghdad and they capture basically an Iraqi army command post where there's an open telephone line to headquarters in Baghdad. And Somerset Share relates how the Iraqi interpreter was working for the British. They told him to get on the phone in terror to say, there are 100 British tanks coming up the road. What am I going to do? And the Iraqis believed it. There were not 100 British tanks. There were no British tanks. They had a few armored cars. And so, the Iraqis, and basically Rashid Ali turned tail and fled, and the Iraqis capitulated, and we walked in. And it was, and the tragedy of that last few days was that I don't know if you know of the massacre of the Jews in Baghdad in end of May, beginning of June, called the Fahud, right? There was a big Jewish community in Baghdad, and of course, a lot of anti-Jewish feeling had been kind of fermented over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years by the Germans. Anyway, the British sent their troops in, but we were too nervous to send we stationed our troops outside the capital, because if we'd sent the troops in, the Iraqis would have seen how few there were, right? So we stationed them outside. So for 3 or 4 days, Baghdad was lawless because Rashid Ali had fled. The mayor was trying to negotiate with the British. The Iraqis had been humiliated. They took it out on the Jews. And they massacred. I mean, it was not by today's standards. I'm not talking tens of thousands, but probably upwards of 1,000 Jews were massacred, and the British did nothing about it. They could have marched in and stopped it, probably, but the reason they didn't was because, for them, they wanted to maintain the fiction that they were a big army, and they weren't. So that was a sort of an unfortunate collateral damage was that massacre was allowed to take place, and the British were blamed for it a lot afterwards. But as I say, there was a very solid reason why they didn't feel they could go in. And when the logistics guys were going into Baghdad to buy fruit and vegetables for the army, right, their instructions were to go to 10 or 12 different shops to get this stuff, because if they put one order in, it was you only need apples for 1,000, So it was like they had to kind of have maintained this fiction they were feeding a big army. So there was all this stuff going on.
It's the most extraordinary story. It really is. I mean, and as you've said, pretty much unknown. So look, James, this has been wonderful. I'm going to put links into the show notes for this. And so what's been the reaction amongst, have you spoken to sort of fellow historians?
My whole book is about why I believe, yes, in one way it was a sideshow, but my whole book, the premise is that actually this was a very significant episode, because if it had gone the other way, you would have heard about it. The fact it went the way it did is you haven't heard about it, right? Because of all the implications of what would have happened if we'd lost Iraq. So I do think there's a general attitude in the sort of traditional historic, and because Funny enough, he won't remember it, but anyway, I went to the Chalk Valley film thing, Chalk Valley History Festival.
Yeah.
I got my book signed by Max Hastings, and I did mention it to him. Have you heard of Habbinayah? Do you know him? Oh yeah, that sideshow. It was like, fine. I mean, I get it, but I think in that historical establishment, it's considered a sideshow. My premise is it wasn't sideshow. It was added because secondly, it's an amazing story. It's a narrative history. You can't get much better than this. And it's a Rorke's Drift moment, right? And it should be a movie.
Nothing that you've said today will make me disagree. So this has been absolutely fantastic, James. Thanks so much. And for listeners, links are in the show notes. But as I said, thank you.
No problem. Very good to talk to you, Oliver. And I'll speak soon.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history on the way. So please do share with friends and family. But until then, thank you and good night.